This is to describe what happens to separate the Renaissance from the Baroque period. Again, the last video you saw really focused on style, what happens in that shift of style. But for us now, let's look at what culturally or historically is happening to make that shift happen. So we're going to look at the early Baroque period. We're going to stay with the Southern Europe, specifically Italy, in these dates, as you can see here, beginning in 1580. We call it the early Baroque period. What's happening is that by the end of the 15th century and into the 16th century, which is the 1500s, there is in Europe, as you probably know, the Protestant Reformation. That is to say that there are leaders such as Martin Luther, and there's a whole bunch of others, John Hus, who are angry with the Catholic Church and the popes in Rome for a variety of reasons. And in any event, in response to that, the Catholic Church launches what we now, as historians, call the Counter-Reformation, or sometimes the Catholic Reformation. They begin by establishing a council of church hierarchy members, cardinals mainly, in a little city called Trent, which is, actually, I can't remember if it's in southern Switzerland or northern Italy, but in any event, Trent. And the council goes on for many years, but ends in 1563. One of the things, and they have many dictates for a way to dust themselves off, to respond to the corruption charges of the Protestants. And one of the things for an art history class that's useful to know is that they ask for artists to reform their art, because to make it clearer, to have accuracy in depicting the biblical stories. For example, they're talking about church art. It should have decorum, that is, should not be lascivious or sexy, and it should be emotionally accessible to to the greater masses. And that these the opposite of these qualities are what the Protestants had been saying, that the art was was unclear, was who knows what it was depicting, it was too sexy by half, and it was for an elite audience, not a general public audience. So what did the Protestants, what were they looking at to make them think that the art needed reforming, among other things? Well, so we're going to look at this. The Renaissance period we tend to think of as ending in 1520, but there is kind of a transition between the Renaissance and the Baroque period that we call Mannerism. See these dates here? Mannerism situates itself right between Renaissance and Baroque, and the Mannerist art is what the Protestants didn't care for and what the Catholics then come in and try to reform with new dictates for what we call the Baroque period. Where did Mannerism come from? Some people just think it's a debasement, or at least a change from Renaissance art, and the culprit of the style is really Michelangelo. I'm showing you we're in the Sistine Chapel. We're not looking at his more famous ceiling, but we're looking at something he did on the wall called the Last Judgment. And it is in some ways typical of a removal from Renaissance into Mannerist style. Last Judgment, there's Christ surrounded by saints and angels, and the blessed are going into heaven, the damned are going into hell. That's what happens at the Last Judgment. It's not clear, I think, even from our perspective here, what is going on in this slide. So this becomes a kind of hallmark of Mannerist art. I'm going to go to a detail here. It's a little cleaner than the last slide because they did clean these frescoes. Again, a detail of the Last Judgment. And you'll note that even in this, again, there's a lack of focus. It's unclear what's going on in the story. But more than that, the poses are quite convoluted. Check this guy out, this guy out. Michelangelo loved to put too many muscles on a body, sometimes not well proportioned. And again, these other qualities, these come to be known as Mannerism. An example of Mannerist, I just have one here to show you, would be this painting by this guy, Bronzino, follower of Michelangelo, in this painting called the Noli Me Tangere, which is which is Latin for "don't touch me." The scene is when Mary Magdalene comes across the resurrected Christ, who's, walking the earth for a bit, and he, she wants to, she's happy. She thought he had died, but he says, "don't touch me. He's no longer a man," is how the theologians would argue this subject. In any event, please look at the painting. Again, notice that the artist here is using the twisted poses of Michelangelo, the musculature that is maybe not quite as clear as it should be. The storyline is probably not clear. It looks like they're doing a little bit of a dance here, maybe even a sexual tease. This is not appropriate for the story. And because of these two other women in the composition, who are oddly composed to begin with, the compositional focus between these, the emotional exchange between these two figures is just a tad off. Again, too much copying of Michelangelo, not looking at nature, but copying Michelangelo's work. This is what is mannerism. To counter this, then, we have our early Baroque reformers. The most famous of them is Annibale Carracci, and I will show you an example of his work. Again, these is beginning post-1580. The work he does is called Domini Quo Vadis, which is also Latin for St. Peter in this case, encountering a vision of Christ as St. Peter is trying to leave town. Rome is a place where Christians are being persecuted. Peter's been imprisoned a couple times. He wants out of this city. He passes a vision of Christ that says, I'm going this way, Peter. Where are you going? And Christ, actually it's Peter saying, "Lord, where are you going?" You're the crazy one. In any event, please note the more naturalistic poses. The figures are drawn from nature now, and so therefore, they seem more well proportioned. The muscles seem more reasonable. I think we get a better sense of the emotional exchange between these two figures. Peter's like astounded by this vision, even frightened by it. Compositional focus, because we don't have all that clutter in the background. We know where to focus our energies, which is in this space between the exchange of these two, and other things, logical shadows, etc. If you want to stop the video and look at the comparison between mannerism here, early Baroque here, please do so and see that you can do this and replicate this in an argument, say, for example, for a quiz. How did this reform come about? Like practically what happened to get this shift from mannerism into Baroque? Well, in Bologna, which is a city north of Rome, northern Italy, there are a family of 3 members: Annibale, the young brother, Augustino, the older brother, and a cousin, Ludovico. And the 3 of them decide that the old system of making art, like having a master and getting some apprentices to come in and copy the master, and that's how they learn, that they were going to establish a school, an academy, that they call the Accademia degli Incamminati, which just means the Academy of the Explorers, of the Wanderers. And in this academy, which is much more like a school of art as we know it, they would get models, nude models, if possible, and draw from nature rather than copying Michelangelo, and hence the style becomes purer, cleaner. Female models were nearly impossible to get. Male models they could get, but they often had to use dead bodies, and that's actually what we're seeing here in this drawing. Also, a little aside, just a tidbit of information, is that Carracci were the inventors of the caricature, a way of distilling the essence of a figure in drawing. This painting is in your textbook. It's by Annibale Carracci, of the Assumption of Mary of the Virgin into heaven. After she's died. Here's her sarcophagus, and she's being taken into heaven by angels, and she's always surrounded at her death by the apostles. That's who these men are. In any event, it's very clear what's going on. The figures have weight. And again, this is a really good example. You can read about it of early Baroque. please also read page 37 in your textbook. This is an altarpiece. These are large paintings that go in a chapel in a church, chapel being a smaller subset of a church. Now, the other great work by Annibale Carracci are these frescoes that he does in a little room in a big palace, little room here, Farnese Gallery in a big palace of one of the church hierarchy. It's not a religious theme, though. It comes from mythology, Roman mythology, Greek Roman mythology. And this is one aspect of both the Renaissance and the Baroque, that sometimes these pagan subjects were used not because these people believed in pagan mythology, but rather they were using it as an allegory, or using the themes as to make some point about Christian thought. In this case, all the paintings that we're going to look at on this ceiling have to do with the redemptive power of love. Now, ceilings are one of the great Baroque canvases. We'll look at a few others later, but the illusion on this ceiling, even though it's a flat ceiling, we can run our hand over here, this is all flat, is that there are lots of frames on the ceiling, and within these frames there are paintings posted there, placed there. I'm only really going to show you this one that's in the middle. The subject of this is the triumph of Bacchus. There he is, and Ariadne, that woman. And the subject is that Bacchus, the god of wine, found Ariadne. She had been deserted by a lover on an island, and he found her, and he loved her, and he married her. And so we're looking at their marriage essentially here. And so again, his love was redemptive, saved her. We see the great party. Silenus, this old guy here on the donkey, also a great drinker, always shown as a drunk man, and these satyrs and fawns. Fawns just have little goat tails. Satyrs have the whole leg thing going on. Nymphs, these women. These are always drunken followers of Bacchus, and you can see the great procession. Notice how clean the figures are. I mean, how well proportioned. Again, the subject is accessible to us. We kind of can figure out what's going on, even though there's a lot of people up there, and a very well balanced composition. Last minute or two to set you up for the next video. There's another version of the early Baroque. It's not the kind of nice classical version of the Carracci, but it's a kind of grittier realism of this guy, Caravaggio. There's his full name, but we call him Caravaggio. One example of a painting here is this. I don't know if you can read all of the... Anyway, there it is. It's called The Lute Player. It's a very early work. It's what we call a genre painting. It's not a religious subject, not from the Bible, but just a scene from everyday life. Here, this boy, a musician, sitting at a table with what we call still life elements, that is, inanimate objects like these flowers and these fruits. This is typical Caravaggio. The boy is shown with, all his imperfections. He's shown in a kind of dark interior. This light is very typical of Caravaggio. And the other kind of thing that Caravaggio is known for, again, in terms of emotional accessibility, are figures that look out at us enticingly, and objects in the painting often placed in such a way as to reach out, what we call foreshortened, so that they are placed in such a way as if we can reach in and grab them easily. I just have a few more seconds, but I'd like you to hear some pages there in the textbook to know about this painting. Caravaggio's Judith and Holofernes, a very typical Baroque subject. She, the princess, the Jewish princess who saves her people by seducing, but then beheading a Assyrian general. Please notice again the quality of light, some foreshortening, the grittiness, the realism as opposed to the idealism of the Carracci. And lastly, please see the next video on this particular painting, which again is in your textbook, and some information about it here.